Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to another edition of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of the Fair Housing and Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. We are joined today by Rachel Wentworth, Executive Director of the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania. She has 22 years of experience in fair housing, including complaint intake, counseling, investigation, test coordination in the areas of rental, sales, insurance, mortgage lending, accessibility resolution of fair housing lawsuits and administrative complaints, conducting fair housing training for a variety of audiences, technical assistance on zoning and land use and fair housing compliance for local governments, and capacity building for other fair housing agencies. Prior to joining the Housing Equality Center, Rachel was a test coordinator at the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. She holds a master's degree in community and regional planning from Temple University. With that, we want to welcome Rachel to PHRC Speaks. Hey, Rachel, how are you?
Good. How are you, Adrian? Thank you for having me on.
And one of the first questions that I have before getting into all the lingo and all that, I want to know how that spark for this work came to be in you. Because it's not as if we wake up, right, and one day we decide, you know what, I'm going to go into fair housing. Is this what you've always wanted to do, or how did that spark occur in you?
Once in a while, somebody asks me this question that I had when I was in college. I had a double major in art and sociology. And following college, I had applied for a number of internships, and I had an offer of an apprenticeship with an arts-related organization, and I had an offer of an internship at a fair housing organization. And I mulled this over a little bit. It felt like a bit of a crossroads in my life, and fair housing it was. And then I think that after that experience, continuing my education and wanting to go into planning, that planning combines a lot of concerns of mine. It obviously the fair housing and equity concerns, environmental concerns, just the importance of the places that we live and the built environment to our lives. It's a fascinating field, and I think the intersection of zoning and planning and fair housing is a very impactful one. It's a very ongoing and present concern in Pennsylvania, of course. And I think those two, the planning, the land use, and the fair housing is a very important intersection.
What is exclusionary zoning?
Well, I'm going to give kind of a broad fair housing definition of exclusionary zoning. I think a lot of the times when you hear in news items, in the media, in discussions of exclusionary zoning, it's pretty focused specifically on affordable and multifamily housing and housing affordability, and how municipalities restrict that variety of types of housing for a variety of income levels, and basically restrictions on affordable housing. But my working definition of exclusionary zoning is not only those practices that limit housing choice for low and moderate income families and individuals, but also specifically anything that restricts housing choice for members of protected classes under the fair housing laws. And that can take a variety of different forms, something like mandated design criteria, very large minimum lot sizes or minimum unit sizes, those regulations that make housing costs incredibly high, and that do exclude moderate income families are certainly qualify as exclusionary zoning, but I would also include things like requirements that limit or exclude group homes for people with disabilities from locating in residential zoning districts, or addiction recovery homes, policies that either favor or provide incentives for developing age-restricted housing as opposed to housing that may be occupied by families with children, failure to make reasonable accommodations to zoning requirements, things like refusing to waive setback requirements if somebody needs to make accessibility modifications to their home. And then also exclusion of new multifamily construction that would be required to fall under the design and construction guidelines of the Fair Housing Act. So that type of housing that would be covered under the Fair Housing Act's design and construction requirements provides more housing options for people with mobility disabilities. And so the exclusion of that type of covered housing, I would also kind of put in this broad fair housing bucket of exclusionary zoning policies.
Thank you. Thank you. So we can agree that affirmatively furthering fair housing has been part of the Fair Housing Act since 1968. And I would submit that the 1988 Fair Housing Amendment Act was an effort to kind of put some teeth on affirmatively furthering fair housing. What do you think has been the lag in making that a reality?
I think that, that the history of exclusion in zoning is so inseparable in our country from zoning itself, that I think, obviously we can agree that there are good things about zoning and that zoning does bring positive aspects to communities. But we also, being aware of the history of our country, being aware of the history of zoning and planning and land use in our country, that there's a history of exclusionary policies being a part of zoning and land use policies from the start. And I think that it's a very entrenched problem, and it's a very hard problem for community members, whether they be policymakers, whether they be elected officials, whether they be residents, to reimagine what a zoning policy would look like implemented in an inclusionary way.
So you talked a little bit about this history. For those that may not understand that history, how did exclusionary zoning get started, or has it always been part of it? As you said, it's always been part of our history. But I also submit, and maybe you can help me clarify the cobwebs in my head, but I also submit that exclusionary zoning could be a way of trying to get around the regulations around affirmatively furthering fair housing. What can you tell me about that?
Well, as I said before, I think the history of zoning is really very intertwined with the history of segregation and exclusion of individuals from communities. And so just, to back up a little bit, do a little history lesson that in the early 1900s in our country, we did have zoning laws that explicitly prohibited the sale of residential property in all white areas to individuals who were not white, and sometimes prohibited the, sale of residential properties to white buyers in an area that was predominantly Black. So there were, very early on zoning ordinances that had this explicit purpose of perpetuating segregation. And, that was in practice. That practice was outlawed there was a 1917 Supreme Court decision, I believe, in Kentucky that found that racially explicit zoning ordinances were unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment and the right to have, the equal right to enter into contracts. So officially, this explicit racist application of zoning ordinances was outlawed. This was early on in the history of zoning being a common method of planning in our country. But then in the 1920s, the Department of Commerce produced a number of publications that encouraged states and municipalities to adopt zoning regulations, both, encouraging the states to empower whatever the unit of local government to have the right to zone, and then sort of providing a template or a model ordinance for those municipalities about what zoning should look like. And among those practices that was encouraged was not only to divide a municipality into uses like commercial and industrial and residential, but to further subdivide those residential districts into types of housing that tended to line up with socioeconomic status. So you would put your low density single family residential housing in one district, you'd put kind of more medium density, you'd put attached single family homes in one district, and then you'd put multifamily housing in another district. And it's actually, because I knew you were going to ask me the fair housing and zoning history question, and I just took a look back at one of these documents, and it was, produced in maybe 1922 by the Department of Commerce, and it gave this example. It was called a zoning primer, and it gave this example of, imagine that you've bought your little plot of land and you've constructed a cozy little house on it. And then there are two vacant plots of land on either side. And then imagine that this giant apartment complex gets built next door to your cozy little single family house. And all of a sudden, they've robbed you of your sunshine and the investment of the last 20 years. So from the beginning, when the federal government promoted zoning as a tool for communities, there was this idea of fear of that you as a resident of this single family home were under threat of the possibility of multifamily housing being built. But that pattern of subdividing residential districts into these different types of housing, different densities of housing, really served to segregate communities economically and to increase racial segregation. And so we know that in communities that have less restrictive zoning or permit more dense housing, they tend to be more racially integrated. But unlike that 1917 decision that outlawed the explicit racially motivated zoning, when zoning ordinances serve to segregate people economically, even when there's been a disparate impact based on race, those types of ordinances have been found to be legally defensible or legally sustainable.
I'm wondering if there is a list of benefits of having more inclusionary, right, or inclusive zoning. And whether, I know that the National Association of Builders has some statistics out there regarding, what it represents in jobs and what it represents in tax, but I'm wondering, do you have any other statistics that you could share regarding, and if you don't, that's okay, but it's just, I'm curious to see if it's a question of narrative.
Right. That's an interesting point, because I know that as fair housing advocates, the kind of the why behind this that we usually put forth is that so people have the right to choose to live in the communities that best meet their needs, and that they have access to the amenities that are associated with those communities. But I always think back to the language that it's in one of the sort of landmark fair housing cases, possibly the Havens case, but don't quote me on that because I haven't looked back. But one of the plaintiffs in that case was a white individual whose statement of the harm that the discriminatory policy did to him was it denied him the benefits of living in an integrated community. And I think that it's a very important benefit. It's the founding of our organization was somebody who back in the 50s just believed passionately that our way out of inequality and racism was to develop genuine, sustained peer relationships between neighbors who were of different races and who were different from each other, and to develop that understanding. And I think that we all realize that we're living in an increasingly global and diverse world and country, and that I think exposure to people who are not like oneself, having one's children be exposed to people who are not like themselves, and to have those positive peer relationships, I think is very important, both for success in future careers and just in terms of personal enrichment. And I've certainly anecdotally read articles and studies, I don't have a citation for you today, but that indicate that more integrated communities do have economic benefits in terms of a lot of measures. You mentioned job creation and various other benefits to the community as a whole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It does have some financial benefits. I think, given today's climate, right, the way things are at this moment, is there hope? Do we craft a narrative as partners in this fair housing justice? Do we craft a narrative that we can all agree upon, that people can lean into, and perhaps start taking proactive steps to have more inclusive? I mean, I know some of the most liberal areas in the Commonwealth that I have visited, but NIMBYism doesn't escape them when a development is coming into an area. And I understand and sympathize and empathize with the elected officials that are basically listening to the concerned neighbors and reacting to the concerned neighbors because they voted them into office, right? And so that's a consideration they have to take. Is it a question of switching the narrative and just kind of doubling down on the education of it?
Yeah, it's a very common, I think you're very right, and my observation is the same, that it doesn't matter whether the community is one that is more politically conservative and may state some disagreement with policies that increase segregation or increase equity. And it doesn't matter if it's a very politically progressive community that really embraces this value of equity and inclusion, that the way it plays out when the addiction recovery home or the affordable housing complex is proposed for the neighborhood tends to be the same, and tends to be the same whether, no matter what the political persuasion of the residents is, that there tends to be this narrative of understanding and agreeing with the importance of whatever, addiction recovery homes, group homes for people with disabilities, affordable housing, multifamily housing, saying that that's important, saying that there's a shortage of those types of housing and a need. However, they have concerns about this proposed project, that it's not appropriate for their neighborhood, that it, whether the public discourse is, blatantly prejudiced and includes conversation of those people bringing down the neighborhood, or if it centers around these kind of pretextual factors like there's not enough parking or it doesn't fit with the character of the neighborhood, that a lot of the situations that come up, I think, they're municipal officials that may want to do the right thing, but are under a lot of prejudice or a lot of pressure, hearing a lot of these sometimes prejudiced opposition from residents. And I think, this is where I absolutely believe we're in the business of changing hearts and minds. But I also have to say that this is why we have fair housing laws, that ultimately the fair housing laws exist because you can't, just knowing what these local conversations look like, there's a limit to the amount of congenial convincing that can be done by a group home operator. And ultimately, we have fair housing laws because everybody has the right to a place to live that meets their needs. And, we have laws to deal with problems that exist, and we have laws to protect people's rights.
In your travels and working with municipalities, how receptive have you found the municipalities on the discussion of inclusive?
Right. Well, I think that there's a variety. We have a situation here in Pennsylvania where we have a very fragmented form of government. You probably know we have the second most largest number of individual units of local government of any state in the nation, behind Illinois. And so there are a lot of local elected officials in the state of Pennsylvania. And they are serving a variety of communities with very different and specific needs. So from very urban to very rural, from socioeconomically distressed to very affluent, from very diverse to very homogenous in terms of race and ethnicity. And these local elected officials are, for the most part, volunteers, very dedicated, civic-minded volunteers who are not professionals in this area and who are often not aware of the compliance responsibilities in lots of areas that come along with their positions. So I would say that the response is varied. There are absolutely those officials that don't want to engage in discussions about fair housing compliance, let alone a more proactive approach to inclusionary zoning and land use. There are those municipal officials who want to do the right thing and are pressured by constituents. And I've certainly been asked to attend zoning hearing board meetings, borough council meetings, just to be that voice of, can you please come and talk to the residents and let them know that we're hearing their concerns, but we have a responsibility to comply with the law. Yeah. And then there's some of those individuals who are simply unaware and are in need of education, and they are receptive to training and education once they have some understanding of fair housing and their obligations. They're willing to reach out with questions. They're willing to ask for reviews of their zoning ordinances. And they're willing to advance positive change in their communities. So it really is it's really a variety. And, it's a very, as we said before, historical, ongoing, long-term problem. I think that we've been talking about this as an organization for about 10 years, been providing education and outreach specifically on this issue for about 10 years. I would definitely say I'm getting more calls with questions, more requests for technical assistance from municipalities that I did 10 years ago, more support from counties, more awareness of their affirmatively furthering fair housing obligations, and more willingness to, at least within the confines of their power as counties, to say, well, we're going to ask that you bring your zoning ordinance into compliance before we fund you, or we're going to require that you receive fair housing training. So I think that there's been progress, but I would also be lying if I didn't say that it was a continuing concern. And I think when these local decisions on individual land use decisions are multiplied over and over and over through our hundreds and hundreds of municipalities in the state of Pennsylvania, it remains an ongoing serious problem. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always thrilled beyond belief when somebody says, I want to listen to you talk about zoning for half an hour.
Thanks. For more information, or if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in a housing transaction, you can visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or call us at 717-787-9780. We're also available online. You can follow us on Facebook, PA Human Relations, and on Twitter, we are PA_HumRelCom. So that is about it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.